A court officer slapped a teenage witness in front of everyone, but the entire room flipped when the boy quietly asked, "Can I speak to my father?" Moments later, a Supreme Court justice walked through the door. He didn't blink. That was the strangest part. 17-year-old Quentin Ray stood there in a plain white button-up, arms loosely at his sides, when Sergeant Nolan Krell's hand struck the side of his face. The sound, sharp and ugly, echoed off the courtroom walls. A woman in the back gasped. Someone else whispered, "Did he just—" No one moved. Judge Lena Brewster didn't say a word at first. Her mouth opened, but nothing came out. The jurors stared in disbelief. Even the prosecutor, a wiry man in a gray suit named Ronald Blaylock, froze with his pen halfway across his notepad. All eyes fell on Quentin, not because they were worried about him, not because anyone rushed to help, but because he didn't react. No flinch, no anger, no tears, just a slow, measured inhale. Quentin looked to the bench and asked, steady as ever, "May I speak to my father?" It was the first full sentence he'd spoken since the slap. The room stayed silent. Sergeant Krell, a man built like a wall with close-cropped blonde hair, didn't apologize. He stood near the witness stand with his hand still partly raised, as if unsure whether he meant to hit the boy or stop him from doing something worse. The confusion on his face wasn't regret. It was fear that he might have messed up. Badly. Blaylock finally found his voice. Your father? Do you need a guardian present, son?" Quentin didn't turn to him. He didn't move at all. His eyes stayed locked on the judge. "Justice Aurelian Ray," he said. That name changed everything. The ripple was instant. A murmur broke out in the gallery. One of the jurors leaned back in their seat like they'd just been stung. The court clerk nearly dropped her stack of files. Sergeant Krell's jaw tightened and his arm dropped slowly to his side. Judge Brewster adjusted her glasses and sat back, the weight of the moment finally catching up. "Did you say Justice Aurelian Ray of the United States Supreme Court?" Quentin nodded once, calm, controlled, almost too calm. And just like that, the courtroom transformed. People stopped seeing Quentin as just another kid in a crisp shirt, the kind of boy they probably assumed was here for skipping school, or worse. Now he had a name they recognized, one tied to power, prestige, and federal courtrooms in D.C. Now suddenly, everyone saw him. But Quentin didn't bask in that shift. He didn't smile. He didn't smirk. He stood still. Same posture, same face, same steady gaze. Like he knew this wouldn't have happened if they had seen him clearly to begin with. Sergeant Krell stepped back, now trying to keep his voice low. "I thought..." He looked like he was reaching for something. His body language... He raised his hand. "He raised his hand because I sneezed," Quentin said plainly. "I was covering my mouth." Another wave of silence. And then, as if the timing had been scripted, the courtroom doors swung open. A man stepped in. Dark charcoal suit, steel gray hair, deep lines in his face that looked like they were carved by time, not stress. He didn't rush. He didn't speak. He just walked down the center aisle of the courtroom as if the whole world was holding its breath. Justice Aurelian Ray. He didn't look left or right. He didn't scan the faces gawking at him. His eyes were locked on his son, and Quentin's face finally shifted. Not into fear or even relief, but something closer to calm recognition. The way someone looks when backup arrives. Not to fight for them, but to witness what they've already endured. Judge Brewster stood. So did the jury. Even Sergeant Krell instinctively straightened up. But it was too late for posture to fix what had just happened. Justice Ray didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. All he said was, "Who laid hands on my son?" But before anyone could answer, the weight of what just happened began to settle on everyone in the room like a storm you never saw coming. Quentin wasn't raised to speak unless it mattered. Back home in Bloomington, Minnesota, inside a quiet two-story brick house lined with law journals and framed family photos, Quentin had grown up surrounded by structure. Not the cold kind, more like quiet rituals. Folded napkins at dinner, books before bed, and talks with his father that felt more like chess matches than conversations. He wasn't a loud kid. He didn't need to be. His mother, Simone Ray, passed away when he was 8. Breast cancer. It hit the house hard, but it never shattered it. Justice Ray never let it. Instead, he turned that grief into something purposeful. He made it a point to be home for dinner every Friday night, no matter what. Even if he'd been on a bench all day in Washington, he caught a flight. That table meant something. Quentin learned early that the world didn't always reward politeness. That sometimes, no matter how straight you stood, people still saw you through a lens they built before you even opened your mouth. But his father didn't raise him to shout about it. He raised him to outlast it. Every morning before school, Justice Ray used to say the same thing. You don't have to be loud to be heard. Let the silence say what their noise can't. Quentin held on to that, not out of fear, but because he believed in it. He watched his father dismantle arguments with just a pause. He saw how silence, when wielded well, could speak louder than any rant. It became his armor. At Lincoln High, Quentin didn't exactly blend in, but he wasn't trying to stand out either. He was one of only a handful of black students in his grade. He joined debate club, kept his grades tight, never had trouble with teachers. The school counselor used to call him impressively composed. That was her way of saying he didn't react the way she expected him to. But not everyone saw that calmness as a strength. Some kids read it as arrogance. Others saw a challenge. Like he thought he was better than them. Like he needed to be brought down a peg. There was one student in particular, Bo Halderman. A loud, square-shouldered linebacker with a mouth that moved faster than his brain. He didn't like Quentin. Maybe it was the way Quentin ignored his jabs in the hallway. Maybe it was the way he corrected teachers without sounding smug. Whatever it was, it simmered. The week before the trial, Quentin found himself standing in the school parking lot after 7th period. He had just finished a debate meeting and was waiting for his ride when Bo and 2 of his friends walked up. You think you're above us or something? Bo had asked. Quentin, backpack slung low, just replied, You got something to say, just say it. Bo didn't say much. He shoved Quentin instead, not hard enough to knock him down, but enough to send a message. Quentin didn't shove back. He didn't flinch then either, but he did report it. That's why he ended up in court, to give a statement as a witness in a harassment hearing that Bo's family tried to keep out of the school board. They pushed to make it a public matter instead. Said the school was targeting Bo, that their son was being misunderstood, so Quentin got subpoenaed. He didn't want drama, didn't want headlines, he just wanted it to stop. And that's the part most people missed. They saw a calm, confident young man in a courtroom and thought he could handle whatever came at it. They didn't see the buildup, the months of being looked at sideways, the quiet sighs he swallowed, the teachers who told him he was so articulate, like it was a surprise. They didn't see the weight he carried every time he walked into a room where people decided who he was before he even said his name. But everything they ignored was about to matter. Because this time, the slap wasn't going to be swept away. This time, someone with power was paying attention. It started over nothing. A dropped lunch tray, a shoulder bump in the hallway, words exchanged just enough to get the attention of the assistant principal. But what should have been handled inside the school turned into something bigger. Mostly because of who was involved. The school security footage showed Quentin walking away first. He didn't yell, he didn't swing, he didn't even touch anyone. He just turned and walked. But Bo Halderman and his crew weren't done. They followed. They wanted a reaction. In the video, you can see Bo shove Quentin from behind. Quentin stumbles but catches himself. He turns, says something too quiet for the mic to catch, and then Bo throws another shove. Harder this time. Still, Quentin doesn't hit back. It wasn't until a teacher on parking lot duty ran over and broke it up that it stopped. Quentin's shirt was stretched at the collar. His backpack had been thrown to the side. He looked embarrassed more than anything. Not angry, not scared, just tired. The school opened an investigation like they were supposed to. But Bo's father, Colton Halderman, wasn't having it. Colton was well known around town. Owned 3 hardware stores, ran a local men's group, donated to school fundraisers. He'd built a reputation as the guy who gives back. He also had pull, So when the school recommended disciplinary action against Bo, suspension and mandatory behavioral counseling, Colton lawyered up, claimed his son was being singled out, that the school was targeting him because of an isolated misunderstanding. He even held a small press conference outside the district office, blaming reverse discrimination and calling Quentin's version of events overblown. That's how the whole thing ended up in Hennepin County Juvenile Court. Not as an expulsion hearing, but as a full-on harassment case. And Quentin, he just wanted to be done with it. He never asked to be the face of anything. Not of fairness, not of racial bias, not of justice. He just wanted to finish senior year, keep his GPA where it was, and apply to Brown University like he'd been planning since 10th grade. But instead, he was preparing for court. Justice Ray didn't try to talk him out of it. He sat with Quentin at the kitchen table the night the subpoena arrived. There were no lectures, just quiet. "I can hire someone," his father had said. "You don't have to speak if you're not ready." "I want to speak," Quentin replied. His father studied him for a long time before nodding. "Then speak carefully." The night before the hearing, Quentin ironed his shirt 3 times. Not because it was wrinkled. It wasn't. But because he knew people were going to look at every detail. If there was a scuff on his shoe, it would say something about him. If he slouched in his chair, someone would say he looked like he didn't care. If he looked too confident, it would be arrogance. Too nervous, guilt. He wasn't on trial. But in some ways, he was. On the morning of the hearing, he sat quietly in the lobby outside courtroom 3B. His name wasn't on the docket as a defendant, but still, a clerk called it out like it was. When Quentin stood, people looked. Just the way he walked into the room changed how some of them leaned back in their chairs, like they were preparing for something. Sergeant Krell was already inside. He stood near the entrance to the courtroom, arms folded, scanning the room the way cops do when they're deciding who looks off. When Quentin walked past him, he didn't say a word. Just gave him a once-over that lasted a second too long. And that's where the tension began. Not with words, with looks, with body language, with assumptions. The hearing itself was supposed to be routine. Quentin would give his account. The lawyers would file their motions. The judge would make a recommendation. It should have been procedural, but it never got that far. Because Krell's suspicion had already started simmering before Quentin ever took the stand. But no one expected that suspicion to explode into something physical. Not in front of a judge, not inside a courtroom, and definitely not toward a witness who hadn't even finished speaking. The courtroom in Hennepin County Courthouse was nothing special. Pale wood, padded chairs, a clock that ticked too loudly when no one was talking. But that morning, it felt like pressure was crawling along the walls. The kind of pressure that makes you sit straighter without knowing why. Quentin sat in the witness box, legs still, hands folded loosely. He'd been called up quicker than expected. The prosecutor, Ronald Blaylock, gave him a small nod as he approached, but didn't say much else. No warm-up. No easing into it. "State your name for the record." "Quentin Ray." "Your age?" 17. "And you're currently enrolled at Lincoln High School?" "Yes." Blaylock cleared his throat. "Can you describe what happened after school on the afternoon of April 3rd? Quentin took a second before answering, not because he didn't know what to say, but because he'd been taught to give people time to listen. "I was in the parking lot. I had just left debate. I was waiting for my dad to pick me up, and then I was approached by Bo Halderman and 2 other students. He pushed me, twice. I didn't respond physically. I told a staff member, and it was reported." Blaylock nodded. "Were you injured?" "No." "Did you provoke Mr. Halderman in any way?" "No." "Did you make any threats, verbal or otherwise?" "No." As Quentin answered, his voice didn't shake. He didn't rush. Every word landed evenly, the way he'd rehearsed. But as he spoke, you could feel something change in the room. It wasn't about what he was saying. It was how. He was calm. Too calm, some people probably thought. He didn't sound like a scared kid. He sounded sure. Some folks don't like that. Sergeant Krell was standing against the far wall, watching. Not just listening, watching. He wasn't even trying to hide it. Arms crossed, eyes narrowed, head tilted slightly, like he was waiting for Quentin to slip up. Judge Brewster noticed too. She glanced at Krell more than once, but didn't say anything. The defense attorney, Howard Sedgwick, leaned forward at his table. He looked like someone's dentist. Neat hair, heavy tie, hands folded just a little too tight. When it was his turn, he walked up slow, holding his yellow legal pad like it held secrets. "Quentin," he said with a polite tone that was too polished to trust. "You said you didn't respond physically, correct?" "Correct." "Not even a raised arm? A defensive gesture?" "I lifted my hands when he got close. To keep space between us. That's all." "And how would someone, say a bystander, interpret that motion? Could it be seen as aggressive?" "Not unless they were looking for it to be." A few people in the courtroom shifted at that. Sedgwick paused, scribbled something down, then looked back up. "You have no history of aggression at school?" "No." "No fights? No written referrals?" "None." "And you believe the school took the appropriate steps?" "I believe the school did what it could. But that's why we're here now." It was a clean exchange. Too clean. Like Sedgwick was trying to stir something that wasn't there. When he gave up and stepped back, he gave Sergeant Krell a look. It lasted just a second, but Quentin caught it. Then it happened. Judge Brewster asked for a 5-minute recess before the next witness. Quentin stepped down from the box, walked toward the side of the courtroom where he'd been told to sit. But as he passed Krell, the officer muttered something under his breath. Quentin stopped, turned slightly. "What did you say?" Krell didn't answer. Instead, he stepped forward and said, loud enough for the room to hear, "Keep your hands to yourself next time." "I wasn't," Quentin began. But before he could finish, Krell raised his hand and slapped him. The sound cracked through the room like something breaking. But it wasn't the slap that made the room stop breathing. It was Quentin's face. Still, composed, almost tired, and the fact that he didn't move a muscle. The fact that Time didn't slow down. It just stopped working right. The moment Sergeant Nolan Krell's hand made contact with Quentin's cheek, everything inside that courtroom fractured. People didn't gasp right away. They didn't even speak. It was like the entire room forgot how to react. Quentin's head tilted slightly with the impact, but his feet didn't move. His shoulders didn't twitch. He stood the same way he did when Bo shoved him behind the gym, grounded, centered, waiting for someone else to decide what they were about to make of him. Judge Brewster pushed herself up from her chair so fast that the wheels screeched against the platform. "Sergeant Krell!" Her voice came out sharp, almost startled, like she couldn't believe what she'd just seen with her own eyes. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Krell didn't answer. Not right away. His eyes were locked on Quentin, who had slowly turned his head back to face forward. "I told him to keep his hands down," Krell said. But even as he said it, his voice sounded unsure, like he'd already realized how badly he had miscalculated. Blaylock dropped his pen. Sedgwick stood frozen, looking like someone had just pulled the floor out from under him. The bailiff near the door took a step forward, unsure whether to intervene or wait for orders. Quentin didn't look around. He didn't touch his face. He didn't cry. He just said again, but louder this time, "May I speak to my father?" This time, the silence that followed hit harder. There was a kind of collective awareness that rolled through the courtroom, like the sound before a thunderclap. People were whispering now, confused, anxious, trying to make sense of what just happened. Judge Brewster blinked, adjusting her glasses like they were the problem. "Your father is present? He'll be here in a minute," Quentin said. "He asked me to text him if something happened." Before anyone could respond, a phone buzzed at the clerk's desk. Then the courtroom doors opened, and everything shifted. Justice Aurelian Ray stepped into the room like he'd already been briefed by every wall and corner in it. He didn't walk fast. He didn't speak. He didn't look at anyone but his son. Quentin didn't smile, didn't move, just looked back. That same steady, quiet connection the two had always shared. Justice Ray approached the bench. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't look for protocol. He spoke directly to the judge, voice cool and grounded. "I was informed there was an incident." Judge Brewster looked rattled. "Justice Ray, this isn't procedure. procedure was broken the moment a court officer assaulted my son during testimony. Krell flinched, not visibly, but inside, something was crumbling. Justice Ray turned to face him now, slowly, as if drawing out each second was an act of mercy. You touched him? Krell opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Then, I thought he was... His hands... You thought... Justice Ray repeated, his voice cutting. That's the problem. It wasn't loud. It wasn't theatrical. It didn't need to be. It was the kind of statement that fills a courtroom more than shouting ever could. You saw a calm, unarmed teenager and decided he was a threat in a courthouse, under supervision, with a judge present. Krell's hands had started to tremble, just barely. But everyone noticed. Quentin sat down again, not because he was told to, because he'd already said what he needed to say. The rest was now in the room with his father. You didn't restrain him, Justice Ray continued. You didn't warn him. You struck him. He turned to Judge Brewster. This is not about my position. This is about precedent. If this officer can assault a witness in front of the bench and walk away with a badge intact, then we're not protecting anyone. We're just performing justice for show. And with that, Justice Ray stepped back, folded his hands, and waited. But no one in the courtroom wanted to be the first to speak, because anything said after that had to mean something. No one said it out loud, but the authority in the room had shifted. Judge Brewster was still seated on the bench, technically presiding. But all eyes were on Justice Aurelian Ray, not because of his title, but because of the way the atmosphere bent around him, like the law had walked in wearing a face people recognized but rarely saw up close. Judge Brewster cleared her throat and leaned forward slightly. Justice Ray, I understand your presence here complicates things procedurally. However, I assure you we will handle this through the proper channels. Justice Ray didn't challenge her. He nodded once. My concern, he said calmly, is not just about my son. It's about the message this courtroom has now sent. Not just to him, but to every young person who walks into a space like this, hoping to be protected by it. Brewster opened her mouth to respond, but Justice Ray wasn't finished. I've served on panels reviewing police conduct. I've ruled on Fourth Amendment cases. I've written opinions on qualified immunity and courtroom procedure. And I've spent the last 20 years watching the slow erosion of public trust in the very systems I was sworn to uphold. He glanced at Sergeant Krell, who now stood stiff, eyes low. So tell me, Ray continued, voice still even, how do you suggest we rebuild that trust when a court officer feels emboldened to strike a witness mid-testimony, in public view, and assumes there'll be no consequence? Judge Brewster leaned back, visibly uncomfortable. I assure you there will be consequence. Assurance is no longer sufficient, Ray replied, his tone never raising but his words growing heavier. Visibility is required. Accountability must be documented. He looked over at Quentin now, whose face had not changed. He looked like he had all morning, patient, unreadable. Krell finally tried to speak. I made a mistake. I accept responsibility. Justice Ray tilted his head. What mistake? Be specific. Krell shifted. I read the boy's body language wrong. I thought he was being disrespectful because he raised a hand to sneeze? Yes. And that warranted physical contact? Krell didn't answer. Judge Brewster finally spoke up. Sergeant Krell, you are relieved of courtroom duty effective immediately. You will surrender your badge until an internal review is conducted by courthouse administration and the sheriff's office. A quiet shuffle of approval moved through the room, but Justice Ray wasn't quite done. He turned back to the judge. With respect, the review cannot be internal only. I'll be requesting an independent investigator through the Department of Justice. Judge Brewster nodded slowly. Understood. Only then did Justice Ray take a step back. He looked over at his son again, and this time Quentin's expression changed. Just slightly. A soft breath. A kind of release, not of tension, but of restraint. The room didn't notice, but his father did. Sedgwick, still standing off to the side, stepped forward awkwardly. Your Honor, do we continue? That question hung in the air. Quentin stood, I'm willing to finish my testimony. Judge Brewster nodded, impressed, but trying not to show it. Very well, Mr. Ray. Please return to the stand. Quentin walked back to the witness chair and sat down again. This time, no one interrupted. No sideways glances. No muttering under breath. Just open ears and still hands. Blaylock, the prosecutor, cleared his throat. Quentin, would you like a moment? No, sir. Then, if you're ready... You were describing the moment Beau Halderman made physical contact with you in the parking lot. Quentin nodded. He shoved me. I didn't shove back. He tried again, I stepped away. That's all. Blaylock leaned into the pause. Why didn't you react physically? Quentin looked out over the room before answering. Because I knew it wouldn't be seen the same way. There was nothing left to say after that. But deep down, everyone knew the real trial had already happened, and not a single word of it was recorded in the official transcript. The rest of the hearing moved slowly, not because the case was complex. It wasn't. But because the room had shifted. Every question, every answer, every objection felt heavier, like it was being weighed in a different courtroom entirely. Quentin answered what he needed to. The facts were clear. Beau Halderman had approached him, pushed him, twice. The school confirmed the footage. 3 teachers submitted statements backing up Quentin's account. Even the defense stopped pressing after a while, their argument thinning like smoke. But no one was paying much attention to Beau anymore. Not really. All eyes kept drifting back to Sergeant Krell, who now sat alone on the side bench, shoulders hunched, the shine of authority gone from his uniform. After the closing statements, Judge Brewster gave a short recess before announcing her recommendations. People filtered into the hallway, talking in low voices, pretending to scroll their phones, but really watching the Ray family. Watching Justice Ray stand next to his son, like a silent warning. Quentin sat on a bench near the vending machines. His father stood across from him, hands behind his back. Neither of them said anything for a while. Then Quentin broke the silence. Do you think they'll do anything real? Justice Ray looked over. They're already doing something real. They're listening. That's not the same as acting. It never is. But listening is where it starts. Always has been. Quentin didn't respond. He didn't need a pep talk. What he wanted was harder. Clarity. A reason. Justice Ray sat beside him. Slowly. You asked me once why I never lose my temper in the courtroom. Quentin looked over. Yeah, I remember. I told you anger makes things louder, but silence makes things clear. Justice Ray let that sit for a moment. But I wasn't always calm, he added. When I was your age, I wanted to break every wall that stood in front of me. But I realized they're built to survive rage. They're not built to survive truth spoken clearly, steadily, over time. That's what erodes them. Quentin nodded, not to agree, but to show he was absorbing it. The bailiff reappeared. Judge Brewster's ready. Back in the courtroom, Judge Brewster took her seat and began reading her findings into the record. She ruled that Beau Halderman's actions constituted targeted harassment and recommended his immediate suspension, plus behavioral intervention. It wasn't jail time, but it would stay on record. It was something. Then she turned to Sergeant Krell. This court has already taken preliminary action by relieving Sergeant Krell of courtroom duties. But given the nature of this incident and the visibility of the parties involved, I am formally requesting an external investigation through the Department of Justice, as well as a public review of all prior courtroom incidents involving this officer. There was a soft murmur from the back of the room. Krell didn't argue. He didn't move. Just sat there, like a statue someone no longer admired. After court adjourned, the press had already gathered outside. Reporters, microphones, flashing lights. They weren't there when the day began. They came after the slap, after the name, after the shift. Justice Ray kept his son close. Quentin looked tired but not shaken. One reporter pushed forward. Justice Ray, any comment on what happened inside today? Justice Ray paused for a second, then replied, I came to see my son testify. I left with a reminder. A reminder of what? The reporter asked. That civility doesn't begin with a uniform, it begins with discipline. And that respect must not only be expected, it must be shown. Quentin looked at the cameras, but didn't speak. He didn't have to. But in that silence, something moved. Not in the air, but in the people who watched. Because this time, they couldn't look away. In the days that followed, clips from the courtroom went viral. Not just the slap, though that moment was shared more times than anyone could count, but the still frame right after. The image of Quentin, unmoved, looking forward while Krell's hand was still in midair. It was everywhere. Some headlines focused on outrage. Others leaned into curiosity. Son of Supreme Court Justice assaulted in courtroom, one read. Officer suspended after striking teen witness, another said. But the ones that stayed up longest were simpler. He didn't flinch. Back in Bloomington, things didn't return to normal, but they settled. Quentin's teachers gave him space. Some classmates looked at him differently, like they didn't know how to talk to him anymore. A few apologized, even if they'd never done anything directly. Others avoided him entirely, afraid maybe they were part of what had gone wrong, even in silence. Bo Halderman's family didn't say much. After the judge's decision, they kept things quiet. The lawyer disappeared from the public eye. Colton Halderman took down his campaign posters for the school board. But something more important happened outside of the headlines. Students started asking questions. In classrooms, in the cafeteria, in after-school meetings. Kids who'd never spoken about fairness or power or what's really safe started talking. Teachers noticed it. Parents did too. And Quentin? He stayed grounded. One night, 2 weeks after the hearing, he sat across from his father at the kitchen table again. No cameras, no audience, just the familiar tick of the old wall clock and the sound of plates being cleared. "You regret going through with it?" his father asked. Quentin shook his head. "No, just tired." Justice Ray sipped from his glass. "Tired is part of it, but tired isn't the end. I just hate that it took that for people to hear me." His father looked up. "And now that they have?" Quentin thought for a second. "Now I know how much they weren't listening before." Justice Ray didn't argue. He didn't try to soften the truth. Instead, he reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thin folder. Inside was a letter from the U.S. Marshals Service. A formal review of Sergeant Krell's conduct had been opened, not just about that day, but his history. Other complaints were being examined now. Some hadn't even been looked at before. "They're watching now," Justice Ray said. Quentin didn't smile. But there was a small nod, the kind of nod between two people who know the road is long, but they're still walking it. At school, the administration scheduled training for court officers and faculty, not just for procedures, but bias, language, presence. Small steps, but they were steps. Not just because of a courtroom scandal, but because of what it exposed, and who exposed it. People began to understand that what happened to Quentin wasn't rare. What was rare was who his father was. And that's what made it impossible to ignore. The lesson wasn't just about race, or uniforms, or courtrooms. It was about perception. About how some kids have to prove they're not dangerous before anyone listens to what they're actually saying. It was about silence. The kind that gets misunderstood, the kind that gets punished, and also the kind that carries power when used with intention. Quentin didn't give any interviews. He didn't join any campaigns. He didn't write op-eds. He went back to school, kept up his grades, applied to Brown like he planned. But people remembered him. Not for what he said, but for what he didn't do. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't strike back. He didn't crumble. And that quiet resistance, that composure in the face of humiliation, left something heavier in the minds of those who watched than any speech ever could. But the story doesn't end there, because stories like this don't really end. They echo. They linger in the way people sit up straighter when a quiet kid raises his hand, in the way a badge is worn with more caution, in the way one boy, for just a moment, reminded a courtroom what justice is supposed to feel like. Sometimes, the most powerful moment in a story is the pause that comes after it. Quentin didn't set out to make a statement. He didn't walk into that courtroom looking for a headline. He came to tell the truth, and ended up showing everyone in that room what silence, restraint, and dignity actually look like under pressure. The officer who struck him didn't just cross a line, he exposed one. The thin, fragile line between how people say justice works and how it actually plays out when no one's watching. Only this time, someone was watching. And this time, they had a voice people couldn't ignore. What made this moment matter wasn't that Quentin's father was a Supreme Court justice. It wasn't even that the courtroom was filled with people who gasped when his name was spoken. It was the way Quentin carried himself, not just when he was hit, but after. When everyone expected anger or outrage, he gave them something stronger: stillness. That kind of strength doesn't come from privilege. It doesn't come from power. It comes from knowing exactly who you are when someone tries to take that from you. And it reminds the rest of us how easily perception warps reality, and how often people like Quentin walk into rooms already carrying a weight they didn't ask for. We talk a lot about justice. But what this story shows is that justice isn't just delivered from behind a bench or passed down in rulings. Sometimes justice comes from being seen, truly seen, without assumptions, without bias, without someone flinching just because you raised your hand to sneeze. There are so many Quentins out there. Quiet kids, focused kids, kids who do everything right and still get handled like threats. Not because they misbehave, but because they're not believed. And that's the point. It's not enough to punish people after they do harm. The real work is in unlearning the reflex that caused it in the first place. It's in changing who gets the benefit of the doubt. It's in asking why someone like Krell thought a teenager like Quentin was dangerous. Not once, not in a flash of poor judgment, but in a setting designed to protect the innocent. Because a courtroom is supposed to be a sanctuary of fairness. But fairness has to live in the people who work there, not just in the wood and rules around them. And if a judge like Aurelian Ray hadn't walked through those doors, would the world have cared? Would the slap have just become another misunderstanding buried under procedure? Quentin didn't fight back. He didn't yell. He stood still and let the world see what happened when someone who never should have been touched was struck. Simply because of how he was perceived. That image is still floating out there, still being shared, still being debated. But maybe, just maybe, it's also being learned from. So the next time someone tells you silence means weakness, or that calm means you're letting something slide, remember Quentin. Remember the boy who stood still while the room caught fire, and waited for the truth to speak louder than any slap. If this story made you think, if it made you feel anything at all, take a second to share it. Not just for views, not just for clicks, but because someone else might need to hear it. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, hit subscribe. Because the more light we put on stories that reflect real experience, the harder it becomes for silence to be mistaken for invisibility.